Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Jeff Dalrymple, and I'm the Executive Director at Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention, also known as ECAP, because that's a mouthful. And here we are today. It's November 2023, just a week out of Thanksgiving, and it is my joy and honor to have Victor Vieth here with us today. On Meet the Experts. So I remember meeting Victor a number of years ago when we were putting together the child safety standards. We had really hoped and worked hard to have Victor a part of that group. It didn't work out, but I've since learned more and more about his work and his expertise, and really a joy and a privilege to have you come on here, Victor, with us for Meet the Experts. So let me just briefly explain. Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention, we're committed to helping ministries create safe places for kids to hear the gospel. And we do that through our child safety standards and our accreditation program, and through content and resources just like this, our series on Meet the Expert. Today, my guest is Victor Vieth. Victor is an expert in abuse prevention and response. He's authored a number of books and articles. Victor, where are you coming at with us today?
I'm in Lewiston, Minnesota, my hometown. So
you're home, but I know you travel frequently.
Yes.
You've spoken on this topic of sexual abuse prevention and response in all 50 states, a number of U.S. territories, and even internationally. Victor works with Zero Abuse Project. I hope here in a moment you'll tell us more about your work there so that we can learn more about Zero Abuse Project. Authored a number of resources, serves on the board of Grace, doing really, really good work in this area. So Victor, welcome to Meet the Experts. Glad to have you here.
Thank you, Jeff.
Now, Victor, how did you first get into this line of work? You were a prosecutor back in the day, is that right?
Yeah, I was a prosecutor in Minnesota for a decade, and specialized in child abuse cases, and just began to notice how often religion was incorporated into the abuse of children. And I recall a case where I walked into court with a girl who was sexually abused by her dad, who was an elder at her church, and she walked into court and saw both of her ministers and half a dozen elders, and she knew they weren't in the courtroom that day to support her. And I'll always remember her tugging on my suit, whispering in my ear, "Does this mean that God is against me too?" And so that and other experiences really crystallized the spiritual impact of trauma and the importance to address that in these cases as well.
Well, yeah, and really propelled you into this field as an expert in this field. I know you don't only work in the faith-based environment, but you're an expert and speak and teach on a number of other non-faith-based environments as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and tell us about Zero Abuse Project?
Yeah, Zero Abuse is a 501c3 nonprofit. We have a number of federal and state grants. A big part of our job is to provide training, technical assistance, publications to child abuse prosecutors and investigators. So we train a lot of multidisciplinary teams. We oversee Child First, which is the largest forensic interview training program in the country, operates in 22 states and 3 additional countries as well. So that's a big part of what we do. We're also developing a program called the Center on Faith and Child Protection, and I'll be overseeing that initiative where we try to bring faith and child protection communities closer together and develop partnerships so that we have a holistic approach to respond to the physical, emotional, and as well as the spiritual needs of survivors.
Well, today we want to make sure that we have time for Q&A later on, but for the next 25 minutes or so, you're going to share with us just on the research on the spiritual impact of trauma and how faith and secular communities can work together to address that. And what we're going to do for our friends here is just do a Q&A in the chat, and then I will be moderating those questions. I may start with a couple of questions when you're done, Victor, and then we'll be done at the top of the hour for sure. But thank you so much for being with us. And with that, I'll turn it over to you for the next little bit here. Thank you.
As a prosecutor and criminal justice professional for 36 years, I have seen up close and personal the physical and the emotional impact of child maltreatment. But the subject at hand today is, what does the research tell us about the spiritual impact of trauma? We'll chat about some studies. We'll also, though, share some good news that research also says if we can help a survivor develop a healthy sense of spirituality, it's a significant source of resilience. So, how do we go about doing that? What is best practice for responding to the spiritual needs of survivors? And what possibilities are there for faith and child protection communities to collaborate together? We have a really pioneering initiative called Children's Advocacy Center chaplaincy programs, and we just received a grant from the Department of Justice to develop additional resources for that work. So we'll chat about that as well. There's a lot of research on this subject. I can't think of anything for which there's a larger body of research that has been so widely ignored by both the secular and the faith communities. Way back in 2009, the American Psychological Association published this literature review. And at that time, they said there were at least 34 major studies involving more than 19,000 abused children. And most of this research found that most children, not all, but most children who are abused are not only impacted physically and emotionally, but also spiritually. How does that manifest itself? This study is illustrative. Back in 98, these researchers intersected with 527 victims of child abuse. Some were beaten, some were sexually assaulted, some were emotionally abused, many all of the above, because we know from research when you're abused in one way, you're often abused in multiple ways, what professionals call polyvictimization. Every child in this study, every single one, was impacted spiritually, which manifested itself in feelings of guilt, anger, grief, despair, doubt, afraid of dying, a belief that God is unfair. What on earth are we talking about? Some years ago, I spoke with a man who decades ago was physically and sexually abused in a Christian boarding school. And he shared with me some of those experiences. And he said, Victor, do you think God understands ACE research, a body of research that calculates your level of trauma? And I said, tell me about that. What are you asking me? And he says, well, I understand trauma research, Victor. I got beaten at this Christian school. They raped me at this Christian school. All my friends were beaten or raped. My very best friend took his life, and the pastor spiritually abused me by saying my friend was damned and I should stop weeping or else I'll share a similar fate. So I get it. He says, I got an A score through the stratosphere. And he said that probably explains why, as a young man, I became addicted to drugs and alcohol. Probably explains why I had 3 failed marriages. It's like I wanted those marriages to fall apart. It probably explains why I used to love to go into a bar on Friday night and get drunk and pick a fight with the biggest fellow in the bar because it just felt so good to hit somebody. But the worst thing I ever did, he said, is I killed somebody. I was high on drugs. I crossed the divider line on the road. I accidentally struck another car. I took a man's life. And so they send me to prison for criminal vehicular homicide. Well, I'm out of prison now. I got a pretty good job as a mechanic. I've been clean from drugs for a year, but I'm just so scared of dying because if I die tonight, how does God sort out my life? Do I get a pass? Does God say, yeah, you did a lot of wicked things, including killing a person, but you know what? You had a miserable childhood. So I'm going to look the other way and on you can go into paradise. A woman I spoke to once said she was sexually abused by a Christian doctor, Christian in parentheses, who said, you're so lucky, you're so special. I could touch sexually any child in my care, but I purposely selected you because of all the adolescent girls I'm working with, your breasts are the most developed. She told me she developed this tremendous anger toward God. God is all knowing, so God must have realized that if my breasts grew early, this man would be attracted to me and would violate me sexually. That too is a spiritual injury. Children who are abused this way, they grow up, they often want nothing to do with organized religion. One man in this particular case said to me, I ain't going to do it, Victor. I'm never, ever going to go back to church. As far as I'm concerned, church is just the cover for the sexual abuse of children. But he said every morning I get up really early and I read the Bible for an hour. I pray for a good 30 minutes before I drive into the office. And I said, tell me about that. Tell me about praying and reading the Bible before you go to work. And he started to cry. And he said, I don't know. I don't know why I do it, Victor. I guess after all these years, I'm still searching for something. Viktor Frankl said, "It is not suffering that is unbearable, it is suffering without meaning." And for many survivors of abuse, spirituality is how they make sense of their suffering, and yet that's the very part of their psyche that is often crushed as a result of maltreatment. This was a study a year ago out of Australia where they compared sexual abuse victims who were violated by a priest with those who were abused by a father or somebody else in their family unit. And they found noticeable differences. They found that when you're abused by a clergy person, the impact on your faith is pronounced, 4 times as likely to have your faith damaged. And this was also a significant predictor for suicidal thoughts, suicidal ideations, other signs of trauma. There are some studies that say this may differ depending on your faith tradition. The study out of Israel on men who were sexually abused by rabbis found that they didn't necessarily lose their faith, but they did begin to think of rabbis and religious institutions differently. Although even here, some had their faith impacted. This man said to researchers, I wanted to believe because believing me protected me from understanding what the abuse had done to me. Realizing what I had gone through suddenly revealed to me a terrible and a black side of the world, a side of disorder. So belief in God somehow provided some meaning for why it had happened. But suddenly I realized I only believed because it was convenient. I left the faith community in anger over what God had done to me, both then and today. I wish I could believe, but I really miss it. This dynamic shows up over and over again in the studies. You're impacted spiritually, distance yourself from organized religion, but you're still on what Dr. Donald Walker called the quest for the sacred or divine. Well, that's the bad news. The good news is if we can develop trauma-informed secular and faith leaders and teach them how to work together, we can begin to address these spiritual wounds. And if we do so, spirituality can be a powerful source of resilience. This and other studies have found that spirituality can play either a negative or a positive role. A negative spirituality would be a victim who says, I deserve the beating, I deserve the rapes, I'm evil, I'm sinful, I'm a wicked party. That is not good. A healthy spirituality, though, you're able to actively turn to your faith tradition to cope with the suffering. This study found another interesting dynamic. The spiritual impact seems to be more strongly correlated to the age you are when the abuse begins. You're 4, you're 5, you're 6. That's when the trauma begins. Well, every part of you, including your view of God or a higher power, is developing. And so if you're abused at a young age, it's like you're stuck in a moment in time. As opposed to your 15, 16, or 17, your spirituality may be more well developed and it's more of a buffer against the trauma. That's a general observation. Each victim, each survivor is, of course, different, but it is something to pay attention to. Study after study after study, year after year, decade after decade after decade says if we could develop trauma-informed spiritual care professionals, trauma-informed mental health professionals, we could teach them how to work together. This is a significant buffer, a significant source of resilience. This study from Johns Hopkins found even with a high ACE or trauma score, even without meaningful medical and mental health intervention, if the survivor develops a healthy sense of spirituality, they were doing a whole lot better than survivors who had no spirituality or even worse, a negative spirituality. This study of adolescents who were sexually abused found that those who maintained a healthy source of spirituality, it was the number one buffer, the number one source of resilience. And this study, done at a children's advocacy center in Texas, found the 2 most important sources of resilience were a healthy spirituality and getting a non-offending caregiver in the corner of the victim. And it wasn't either or. It wasn't like if you get one of the two, you're good to go. Both had added benefit. And the reason appears to be this. If you could get, say, non-offending mom in the corner of the victim, then that child knows somebody's going to be there to feed them, to clothe them, to get them on the school bus on time, to comfort them in the middle of the night if they have a nightmare, to bandage their knee if they skin their body and need a bandage. Somebody's going to be there to help them with their homework. Their day in and day out physical and emotional needs will be addressed. But they still have these profound questions. I prayed and I prayed and I prayed and I asked God to stop the abuse, but dad continued to touch me. So what does that say about God or me or both? And if we could work with a survivor to process those difficult inquiries, they were doing the best in this particular study. The American Psychiatric Association, American Psychological Association, other mental health organizations recognize there's room to collaborate between the faith leader and the secular mental health provider. I consulted on a case where a father sexually abused his daughter, and she was growing up in a conservative Lutheran community. And there, you're not going to take communion until you're 13 because the theological concern that if you eat or drink this carelessly, you could eat or drink to your judgment. And as offenders do, they always twist the theology to their benefit. So her dad said to her, "Hey, when you're 13 and you start to take communion, I won't sexually touch you anymore because then Christ will be inside you." So she hangs on with all her might, thinking when she's 13, the abuse will be over. The night before her first communion, her dad sexually assaults her yet again. When the abuse is over, she says, "Father, this is the last time, right? Because you told me when I take communion, this will stop." Her dad gives her a vile laugh and says, "There ain't no God, honey. I just said that to keep you quiet. Well, now you're a young woman, so I'll let you in on a secret. This will end when I no longer desire you." Consistent with the spiritual injury research, she is now filled with rage toward God. The next morning, when she takes her first communion, she purposely spits in the communion cup. She chews the wafer vigorously. In her brain, she says, "I hate you, Jesus. I hate you so much. And within an hour, I'm going to poop you into my toilet and flush you the blank out of my life." Now, fast forward decades later, she's in therapy, sharing this with her mental health provider. This is outside the area of expertise of most mental health professionals. So, long story short, the professional connects with a trauma-informed Lutheran minister trained by us and knew how to apply research from Dr. Donald Walker and others, which says the answer to bad theology is good theology, but you don't give a victim the answer, you lead them to possibilities. It's akin to cognitive behavioral therapy. And so the pastor says, "Let's do a Bible study together. Today, the story is the crucifixion of Jesus. What are you reading here?" "I'm reading the Roman soldiers are crucifying our Lord to death. They're mutilating his body." "Yeah, that's what I'm reading too." "And what does Jesus say to the soldiers?" "Forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." How would that apply to your life? The pastor said, I mean, if Jesus could forgive these soldiers for mutilating his physical body to death, do you think he could forgive you for spitting in the communion cup decades ago, the night after your father raped you? "I guess I never thought of it like that. Maybe he could." Yeah, it's something to think about. That's what is supported by research and common sense. Sometimes the therapist needs to be the consultant to the spiritual care worker, the pastor, priest, or a rabbi who may not have expertise on how do you respond to a suicidal thought or cutting behaviors or eating disorders. They need to have a good working relationship with child protection professionals so that they can make a quality referral. And mental health professionals say there's plenty of room for limited, even full collaboration. I know a woman who gets a diagnosis from her doctor of depression, and the doctor makes a referral to a secular psychologist. The woman's making great progress, but eventually in therapy, all of her questions are spiritual. What does God say about depression at a level where you can't get out of bed the morning of your daughter's recital? What does God say about sadness like that? And her secular psychologist said, I don't know. I don't share your faith tradition, but this is a critically important question. So, long story short, that particular woman ends up with a medical doctor, a secular psychologist, a spiritual care worker, signs releases for all three so that they could all be on the same team. And she says without that approach, she would have been back in bed and not been able to get out of her room each morning. Numerous mental health organizations say many people are three-legged stools. They need medical care, mental health, and spiritual care. And we need to pay attention to all three prongs. Otherwise, we forfeit the right to call ourselves trauma-informed. This is research I referenced earlier, which finds the answer to bad theology is good theology. I'll give you another example. A minister sexually abused his daughter. His daughter says, Dad, this is sinful. It's wrong. And her father, a clergy person, says, well, there are exceptions in the Bible, and he opens the Bible to the account of the creation of the world in the book of Genesis and says, look, when it's just Adam and Eve, God used incest to get the old world going. And after Noah and the great flood, God again turned to incest to repopulate the earth. Well, daughter, God has come to me in a dream like he did to Joseph. God has said our Christian community is under attack from without. We must repopulate from within. I don't want to do it, but just like God said to Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, and we just have to rely on God knowing what the Lord is talking about. I don't want to do it, but I have to touch you sexually. That's about as bad as can be. Long story short, a trauma-informed minister in collaboration with mental health provider knows the answer to bad theology is good theology, and so says to the victim, let's do a Bible study. And the Bible study was the temptation of Jesus. And the pastor says, what are you reading here? It looks like the devil's tempting Jesus with the Bible. Yeah, what do we learn from that? I guess not everybody who uses the Bible is representing God. Yeah. And how does Jesus respond? Well, he puts it in context. Well, let's do that here. What is the inspired writer telling us about the creation of the world? It has nothing to do with the sexual abuse of children. What can we learn from the great flood? It has nothing to do with the sexual abuse of children. What can we learn about Jesus's thoughts on child maltreatment? The answer to bad theology, research and common sense says, is good theology. Diane Langberg, who works with a lot of survivors of abuse, says she will often direct them to the Psalms or the prophets to help them find words to reconnect to their sacred texts. If I was working with a victim of clergy abuse, I might direct them to the prophet Jeremiah, who says to the religious leaders of his day, oh yeah, you're clean and shiny on the outside, no doubt about that. And you go into the shul or the temple and you say, oh, I'm safe. I'm in the temple. I'm in the temple. Don't count on it. God sees the blood on your hands. God sees what you do in the dead of the night. That might be very comforting to a survivor whose faith community has rallied around the offender and ostracized the victim. When I teach faith leaders, I say you need to be trauma-informed. You need to understand basic trauma research. Otherwise, you will look at somebody who struggles with alcohol abuse or drug abuse or adultery or any number of other conditions, and you won't recognize these as signs of trauma. You will likely label them as sins. But if you're trauma-informed, you'll shift from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. Why do you get drunk every Friday night in a bar and have sex with somebody you're not married to, even though you know it's crushing your spouse? What happened to you? That is trauma-informed ministry. And we don't ignore needs for chemical dependency work or mental health or medical care, but we're going to make trauma-informed referrals working in tandem with our local accredited children's advocacy center. We will stay in our lane. The victim is dialoguing with us for spiritual care. We're going to stay within that lane. We're going to refrain from platitudes. So many survivors tell me, I go to my pastor, I get a prayer, a Bible verse. It's like, take 2 aspirin, you should be better in the morning. That is not a trauma-informed ministry. Ministry is for life. It's an up and down process, and we need to have a realistic understanding of that. So many survivors say, I hate it, I hate it. I go to my pastor, and they are right away talking to me about forgiveness. I worked with a man who was tortured by his father during childhood. And he said he was really struggling with forgiveness. In fact, he didn't want to forgive his father. He hated his father, but his pastor kept pushing him toward forgiveness. Long story short, I sent this man a passage from Martin Luther's Table Talk, where somebody said to Luther, "Well, what if somebody hurts you so bad you try, but you just can't forgive? Are you going to go to hell?" And Luther said, "Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? That would put you under the law again. It would mean that what happened on the cross was worthless. Jesus died for all our sins, all our struggles. The reality is nobody can forgive quite like God, not this side of eternity. So stop worrying about stuff like that and just focus on the cross. Forgiveness is a gift of God. It'll come on its own time. You cannot force it. We need to teach clergy that basic principle. And working with a victim, let's talk about justice. Let's talk about mercy. Let's talk about righteous indignation. Let's talk about the verse in Romans and how God-given authorities do have a role to investigate and prosecute these crimes. There are earthly consequences to offenses in this troubled land. That is a more trauma-informed approach. Sometimes an adult victim will want to sit down in the same room with their offender, and pastors and other clergy are not trauma informed. That seems like them to a good idea. Isn't that what Matthew 18 talks about? Well, if you're in trauma informed, you'll know that even if the offender admits the crimes, they're going to justify it. They have cognitive distortions. There's a man who was sexually abused at a church camp, and he wants to reconcile with the offender. He tracks down the offender in a nursing home, and the offender freely admits sexually abusing this man when he was a boy. But he says to the man, "Hey, don't you remember what you were like back then? You stuttered, you were shy, you were awkward. Getting you out of your shell, past your shudder, is why I touched your genitals. It's why I sexually touched you back then. It got you past your stutter, got you out of your shell." Now, do you honestly think you would have grown up to be a famous actor if I hadn't sexually assaulted you? And the man said he drove away from the nursing home thinking, is that right? Is the reason I'm an actor today, is the reason I got past my stutter, because this man sexually assaulted me as a boy? God does not require us to put a victim in the same room with an offender when they're only going to be emotionally abused all over again. That is not scriptural. Kelly Clark is no longer with us, but he made a lot of money suing churches and other institutions. And he wrote a law review article, and he said, to be honest with you, I never had a client who wanted to sue you. They just wanted you to act godly, and you refused to do it. All they wanted to hear from a religious institution was, "I am so sorry this happened, full stop." And as soon as you went beyond the full stop, it sure sounded like an excuse. They often wanted symbolic gestures that could help them heal. Several women go to elders and say, "Hey, we were abused here as children. We want to reconnect to the faith community. We want to pay for it ourselves, but we want a memorial rock garden with a waterfall, fall and flowers, and a bench where you could come and pray and meditate, and that'll help you calm yourself before you go into the institution where you're abused." And the elders said, "We ain't going to do that, because then everybody for the rest of time will know we had a child molester in our employment." That is not trauma informed, and I would submit it is not Christian, or whatever your faith tradition. It is not godly. And so, long story short, these survivors sued the institution, got a large judgment as a result. The rock garden would have been cheaper and more godly. They don't want you to rewrite the history. If you had abuse, they want you to talk about it honestly and openly. They care about policies. In most faith communities, at least in the Protestant world, they don't have any policies, much less evidence-based policies, and that is driving survivors away from our community. Faith without works is dead, and if you don't have evidence-based policies, your faith is either dead or, at the very least, on life support. And then they need practical help as well. One woman was faithful in church attendance, stopped cold turkey. Pastor tracks her down at her house and says, "You okay, Martha? What's going on?" And she says, "Well, you played a hymn that really hurt." Pastor says, "Tell me about that." And she says, "Well, I joined your church 30 years ago because I checked all the hymnals, the area churches, and you didn't have that hymn that really bothered me." "Martha, I don't understand. Tell me more about this." And she opens up and says when she was a little girl, her dad sexually touched her, but he would always hum a certain hymn during the abuse. And she said, Pastor, you put up that PowerPoint for the special Lenten service, and there was the hymn. That is such a trigger to me. It's all I could do to avoid breaking down in church. I got home, I cried 3 days straight. I cannot do it. I can't go back to church and run the risk you'll ever play that hymn again. You know what a trauma-informed response is. Thanks for telling me, Martha. As long as I'm pastor, I promise we'll never play that hymn again. It's listening to survivors and figuring out creatively how they could reconnect to their tradition. In my seminary, pastoral care professor Frombach put this on the board one day. I thought it was brilliant. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do, but I'll stick with you till we figure it out together. A survivor of abuse may have 100 needs. It's overwhelming for them and for you. Humility and honesty is good pastoral care. I'm going to stick with you till we figure it out together, one day at a time. That's the lesson of manna. That's the lesson of the Lord's Prayer. Give me my daily bread. What do you need to get through today? We'll worry about tomorrow when tomorrow comes. 2017 study in children's advocacy centers across the land found that many survivors are raising to governmental officials, am I still a virgin in God's eyes? I prayed so hard, but the abuse didn't stop. And some CACs don't know what to do with that. Some say, well, the kid's Jewish, I'll bring in a rabbi. They're Catholic, I'll bring in a priest. They're Baptist, I'll bring in a pastor. But only 3% of seminaries in the United States have any training on child maltreatment. So even well-meaning clergy often make errors. They are not trained about basic trauma principles. They don't know what to do, and they don't know how to coordinate with medical and mental health providers. So this study said we have work to do. We have to dramatically improve the knowledge of secular communities on the spiritual impact of trauma. We have to dramatically improve the knowledge of faith leaders beginning at seminary, and somehow we got to teach them to get over the distrust of one another and to work together. Anything short of that is not trauma-informed. Which leads me, Jeff, to a pioneering initiative we began some years ago where, hey, we have chaplains in the military, we've got chaplains in hospitals, we've got chaplains in police departments. We've known for a long time that in your working with victims or professionals who've endured trauma, the benefit of spiritual care. How come we haven't figured this out and developed unique chaplaincy initiatives for children or adult survivors of abuse? The Julie Valentine Center in Greenville, South Carolina, was the first CAC in the United States to develop such an initiative. Every year, hundreds of children and their family members seek the services of a chaplain. Today, there are 6 accredited CACs who have implemented a chaplaincy initiative. And just a few weeks ago, the United States Department of Justice Office of Victims of Crime awarded Zero Abuse a $500,000 grant over 3 years to develop resources, toolkits to spread this reform and to fund the very first intensive research initiative to see if this program is having an impact. Where do you go for training? There's a lot of great groups. I'm biased, of course, but Zero Abuse is a really intensive 2-day curriculum called Keeping Faith. Every CAC chaplain has gone through that initiative. I do a lot of work with Sacred Spaces, which assists the Jewish community throughout the United States and has extraordinary resources. As Jeff mentioned, I'm on the board of directors of Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment, which also has quality training. They do quality investigations if you need that service, and quality case consultations, and a number of resources as well. I've published a lot. Here's an open access article, really doing a deep dive on the research on the spiritual impact of trauma. We did a law review article on the chaplaincy initiative. I co-edited this series of articles for a seminary journal, again, all open access articles. Jeff just told me he gave my book to a bunch of clergy. This was my thesis for seminary, where I did a deep dive on the ancient world. What did Jesus say about child abuse? How did the early Christians respond to that? And there's extraordinary information in that book that can be of assistance to you. And I'm a huge Bonhoeffer fan. Actually, he probably never said this, but it accurately reflects his own theology. Silence in the face of evil is evil. Not to act is to act, which by the way, is supported in the book of Leviticus, where the ancient writer tells us that God is upset not just with those who are sacrificing their children to death, but those who are looking the other way and not acting. So multiple sacred texts say that a godly community has child protection as a very, very high priority.
Victor, difficult, but so very helpful. I'm grateful for your research, your voice, all of the resources that you've really dedicated your life to this topic. And we are so very grateful. It was a joy. Just a few days ago, I was in Tampa, Florida with the Florida Baptist State Convention and met Chaplain Bill Chicano. I think I'm saying his last name. He's with the Highlands Sheriff's Department and and told me about this project and the funding that you all received at Zero Abuse Project to put chaplains in CACs, child advocacy centers, across the country. So congratulations on that. We're very, very excited about that initiative. And Bill came right up and was interested in our work at ECAP and said he knew you and was a part of this new initiative. So praise God. That's really, really great news. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here with Victor Vieth. Victor is the Chief Program Officer, Education and Research of the Zero Abuse Project based in St. Paul, Minnesota. They're dedicated to education, training, and survivor support in order to eradicate child sex abuse, hence the name Zero Abuse Project. Victor, thank you so much. We're going to go into a time here of Q&A. Honestly, we've got to get you on for more time because even as you're talking, I'm thinking, man, I wish we had more time to just dig deeper into this because this is so very, very helpful. I want to make sure that we have some time to take some questions from our audience. And then I think you also want to share about some more research and things that you're doing. Why don't we start there? Because I think that's really important and it comes very naturally off of what you were just sharing. Can you talk a little bit more about the research on the spiritual impact of trauma and how faith in secular communities, no, please forgive me. What you wanted to talk about in the Q&A was the importance of theological engagement with this subject. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I referenced in the presentation that Dr. Walker and others have found the answer to bad theology is good theology. But in order to apply that approach, we need clergy who understand the basics of trauma, and they're really good at listening. And they don't plow in and give victims a cookie cutter answer because survivors may find different things comforting in the sacred text. So listen to them and then figure out what would be a Bible story or a connection that might help them think differently. So the example I gave of a case in the Lutheran Church where a victim is led to believe that they're going to go to hell because they spit in the communion cup, and they're referencing Apostle Paul's writings about, take this seriously or you could eat or drink to your judgment. How do you turn that around? And so what the pastor did there is, let's look at the crucifixion of Jesus. Jesus forgave the Roman soldiers for mutilating his body to death. Surely he could forgive you for the communion cup. It's almost like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is an evidence-based approach that says how you think about something determines your emotions determine your actions. So offenders twist scripture and that crushes the victim. So how do I undo what the offender has done and bring the sacred text so that they are supportive of the victim's recovery as opposed to crushing the victim?
Thank you, Victor. Appreciate that. So what are first steps for a ministry leader who wants to become more trauma informed? My guess is that some of the training that you all provide could be helpful. What else would you say to get them started?
Couple of things. One, if you got a connection to a seminary, give them a call, send them an email and say, hey, only 3% of seminaries in the United States have a course on child abuse, and the world is changing, and we're going to need 900 CSC chaplains, but that means seminaries are going to have to improve their game quite a bit. And we have a program called Child Advocacy Studies where we work with undergraduate and graduate institutions to improve training. And so faith communities need to get on board that ship, work with us. And we have toolkits, other resources. I actually teach a seminary course at 2 accredited seminaries, and we've helped other clergy implement similar training. So that's one thing, and that's the ultimate long-term solution. In the short term, you're already through seminary. Our Keeping Faith program is very intense 2-day program. We offer it online, so it's easy to get to. We can also do it in person. And so folks reach out to us and we bring it to their community. And so reach out to us. And that's a really good program. One of the modules already has 2 published studies from Pepperdine researchers documenting its efficacy. And they're also, for years now, been taking a look at the program as a whole. So we hope to be able to say truthfully, we know we're teaching research, but we also hope to say it's an evidence-based model as well. So that's a really good initiative to reach out to us on.
Excellent. That's great. Thank you so much. We're going to share some of these resources as well for those who it's a fire hydrant of content. And so we'll be sure to share some of these links. What would you say? Remember, we're looking at a largely evangelical audience. So this question, I think, is unique to our tradition. What would you say to a ministry leader who's hesitant about trauma-informed care because of concerns related to sufficiency of scripture? What would you say to them?
I would say you need to open up your Bible, because it's hard to go very far without finding accounts of trauma, the sexual assault of Tamar, the sexual exploitation of Bathsheba, for example. John Schutze is a conservative Protestant seminary professor, did a really great deep dive on that. And he said, hey, a lot of people want to rewrite that text and cast equal or primary blame on Bathsheba, but you can't get that out of the sacred text. So early on, the writer says, well, all the kings are away at war. David is up to mischief. He's walking around on the roof of the palace. His eyes are wandering. What is Bathsheba doing? She's taking a bath on the roof, which is where you would do it in that era. And it's not a bubble bath. It's not erotic. She is cleansing herself after her menstrual cycle. She's honoring God based on the Jewish tradition of that time. And it's not her idea to go over to the palace. David summons her. She would have had no idea that this was going to turn into sexual exploitation. We're told that David is a man after God's own heart. Why would she have suspected that? She had no power in the situation. Her husband is away at war. Who is she supposed to call out to for help? David exploits her, sends her back, used and abused, probably to never be heard from again, except for the pregnancy. And then what happens next? David takes the sin to higher and higher levels. It turns into murder. But what's really interesting, Jeff, is when God intervenes and sends the prophet Nathan, he doesn't send Nathan to David and Bathsheba. He sends the prophet to David and says, you are the man. You are the one who's responsible for this. So God is trauma-informed. It's just not religious leaders who often understand the text. And in the New Testament, the entire Christian community is founded in an act of child protection. When Herod orders the murder of all the boys below a certain age in Bethlehem, God doesn't swoop down with a legion of angels. What does he do? He gives a warning to the Magi. He gives a warning to Joseph, who passes on that warning to Mary, and they all act to save the baby. So those who are struggling with, oh gosh, is it really scriptural to do child protection policies? Your church wouldn't exist if it weren't for an act of child protection. And oh, by that way, that baby Jesus that we worship here in a few weeks as we approach Christmas, there are 2 lineages of Jesus in the Bible. The lineage in the Gospel of Matthew tells us the Lord is the descendant of all these movers and shakers of Israel. But then there's a break, and we're told he's also the descendant of 3 sexually exploited women. We mentioned Bathsheba as one, but also Rahab and Tamar. So I would argue compassion for victims, it's in the very DNA of Jesus, the very blood of God. And then Jesus grows up and references children at every particular level. In Mark 9:36-37, Jesus says, children are messengers from God, and how you treat that child at the end of the day shows what you really think about God. In that era, the custom in the Jewish community was, if you had to send your words to somebody far away from you, you might retain a messenger. And then if you're the recipient of the message, you were expected to wine and dine and treat royally the messenger. How you treated the messenger said what you really thought about God. So Jesus said, children are messengers from God, and how you treat the child at the end of the day says what you really think about me. Better a millstone around your neck and drowned in the sea than to hurt a child. Many conservative scholars say Jesus was saying anything you do to damage a child's faith will be viewed quite harshly by God. Well, we know from research that I just went through a few minutes ago, nothing comes as close to damaging a child's faith and sending them away from the faith community quite like child abuse. And then Jesus gave us the bone-chilling warning, don't count on it. Just because you're a great religious leader, just don't count on that getting you into heaven. A lot of people are going to be sent away on Judgment Day by Jesus because you didn't care for the least of these. So I think there's an awful lot in the sacred text that say we need to get our act together. And I say to my Christian friends, I'm not asking you to do anything new. I'm asking you to do something very old, to once again read the old stories of Jesus and the children, but this time put them into play.
Wow, I gather you've had that question before. So this is so very important. This is not merely a matter of risk management, although there's an aspect of that, but we as Bible-believing, gospel-preaching Christians have a care for people. We believe this is a matter of biblical stewardship. We'll stand before the Lord and give an account. And as I hear you sharing today with us, Victor, I'm really compelled that this is a great commission issue. The spiritual trauma and the spiritual impact when abuse happens in that ministry context is very, very difficult to hear and to recover from. And so I just commend those who share our faith tradition that this is a great commission issue. And to your point, I'm just trying to put an exclamation mark behind what you're saying there, is so very important. And what I also loved about what you shared is you immediately took us to scripture. And so I appreciate that. Can you give us some principles for where spiritual authority and influence should end and where medical care or trauma therapy should begin when helping a survivor?
Yeah. Many survivors suffer significant mental health and medical issues. If you're beaten, there may be severe injuries, even if it's a sexual assault. There may be a profound impact on your medical well-being throughout your life cycle. And so trauma history needs to be shared with your medical provider. ACE research tells us you're more likely to suffer from numerous diseases as a result of trauma, things we would never think of being correlated with child abuse, things like cancer. And the reason there's a correlation is if you've endured trauma, especially trauma in multiple categories, you're more likely to smoke and engage in other behaviors that increase your risk for disease. But even if we, in the research, isolate your contributory behaviors, trauma changes the development of your brain. It weakens your immune system, and so you're more susceptible to cancer and other diseases. So medical communities are increasingly aware of that. And mental health providers know, if they're well trained, how to respond to trauma. And a lot of approaches in mental health care are consistent with things we've done in the church for centuries. I'm looking for it on my desk here, but I think it's in the other room. But there's just a new book out from Stephen Saunders, who's a head of psychology at Marquette University. He's also a Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod a church goer. And he makes an argument that Martin Luther's pastoral care was akin to modern cognitive behavioral therapy. How you think about something determines your emotions determine your actions, change how you think about something, and everything else goes better as well. But the expertise of the clergy, if they become more trauma-informed, is to address those spiritual wounds. We know from research most mental health providers, they're just not fluent in spiritual injuries, and even though they recognize it's important, they don't feel competent to address that. So there's only so far that the mental health provider can go, and the medical provider, the faith leader needs to come on board and be part of that collaboration. I know, sir, for some faith leaders, that's scary, but it's also scary for secular leaders as well. But if it's the children we're concerned about, we need to overcome those fears and learn how to break bread with one another, and come together for the betterment of children.
Very helpful. Do you think that changing sexual norms in our culture have impacted the frequency of sexual abuse? And does that mean for prevention? And what does that mean for prevention measures in response? It was
Um,
kind of a two-part question. You want me to do one at a time?
uh, I think I understand it. Um, we got to start understanding the history of abuse in this country and in this world, and we have to stop pretending that suddenly this just cropped up overnight and we want to blame other people for it. Jesus, according to Lloyd DeMoss, lived at a time of egregious sexual abuse. The Roman Greco community practiced pederasty. It was thought to be a step up in light and sex, to have sex with a boy. Many people think Paul, when he says don't exchange natural for unnatural relations, he was talking about pederasty. And so sexual abuse, the beating of children, the emotional abuse of children, the spiritual abuse of children has been around for centuries. And that is what we need to focus on. And if we focused on that, virtually every social ill known to humankind would decrease.
What ideas do you have for denominations and ministry associations to take up the call to protect children? For example, you mentioned that you worked with a number of seminaries. What are your hopes for the future in partnering with seminaries?
We need to get to a point where every seminary has either a standalone course on child abuse, or you have a module on child abuse in every particular course. So if you're teaching a course on Christian history, you should study the history of abuse within the church. You should study and learn from the SBC sexual abuse scandal, the scandal in the Roman Catholic community. There's scandals in other faith traditions. What can we learn from that? What went wrong? And in particular, what went wrong theologically, and how do we avoid that in the future? We need, if you're teaching pastoral care, what are basic trauma research principles? How does trauma impact a child or an adult survivor? And then how do you address that in pastoral care, and how do you coordinate that with medical and mental health providers? Folks need to know about that. They need to know what is an evidence-based policy on child protection, so that they can go into their ministry and know what a good policy looks like. They need to stop listening to lawyers and insurance companies and start listening to God. One of my problems with many policies is because we listen to lawyers and insurance companies, the policies narrowly focus only on preventing sexual abuse within the church. Why? Because those are the kids that might sue us. I don't want to stand before God someday and defend that. We should also care about sexual abuse in the home, physical abuse in the home, emotional abuse, neglect, child torture. And the irony, Jeff, is even if you sinfully only cared about preventing sexual abuse within the church, you can't accomplish that unless you care about abuse in the home. Because when kids are abused in the home, especially in multiple categories, they are like neon flashing lights of trauma, and then an offender in the church violates them all over again. So trauma-informed approach breaks us out of this silo and says, we're going to care for 100% of the kids entrusted to us. And I don't care if they're beaten or raped or emotionally abused or tortured. I care about them because God has entrusted them to me. And just that small shift would dramatically change the church. And I would submit it would dramatically change society.
That's outstanding. And I think it really goes along with some new initiatives that we've got at ECAP, where we're really wanting to go upstream. My wording just in educating. If we're starting with our ministries being safe places, also equipping through those ministries, almost like a beachhead approach, right? Where we can raise the awareness of sexual abuse in our culture and start equipping parents and other caregivers to understand the problem of abuse, how to recognize signs of abuse, how to understand grooming behaviors, and really how to talk to our kids in age-appropriate ways about abuse, on a foundation of wisdom and discernment, not panic. What about the special needs population? What do you know about the problem of sexual abuse in the special needs population? It's something that I've been learning more about. Curious if you know of any research on this topic.
Yes, if you have children or adults who have a special need, they're at heightened risk for abuse. My wife was part of a ministry once where she worked with adults who could not communicate except with a grunt, and they needed significant help for feeding and going to the bathroom and the like. Well, you just can't compromise on your policies in working with that population because they're so easy to abuse because they can't easily communicate the trauma. So it's more than just a background check. Background check catches virtually nobody. But pay attention to what people are posting on social media, and you have to have other checks and balances. How do you monitor those who are working with those who have a special need? There's got to be always at least two adults. The two adults should not be best friends or related with one another, because if somebody violates the policy and you love that person, you're going to look the other way. And so, I mean, those are things you just have to think through actually with all of your ministries, but you can't have any compromise when you're working with a special need population because they have fewer resources to protect themselves.
I'm sure so much more can be said,
Yeah.
but Victor, so very thankful for you, thankful for your voice on this topic, all of your work, your research, your advocacy. Again, very excited about that, the chaplaincy program in CACs. Could you just tell us really quick, what is a CAC and what should every pastor need to know about their local CAC?
Yeah, beginning in the 1980s, children's advocacy centers began to develop in the United States. Before that, if a child is abused, oh, they go to the police station to be interviewed. Then they go to the social work agency to be spoken to about their trauma. Then they go to a doctor. Then they go here for counseling, and they have to repeat the trauma multiple times. And instead, a CAC says, hey, instead of these sterile, scary environments, why don't we build a house and we'll make it child friendly and we'll make all the services come to the survivor. So a child goes to a children's advocacy center. That's where they get a well trained professional to speak to them about the trauma. The interview is recorded, so we don't need to have the child repeat the trauma. And that's where they get a medical, and that's where they get mental health. That's where they get victim services, and all the professionals come to the child. That movement has spread. So 90% of the country is served by a Children's Advocacy Center. They meet national accreditation standards. So if you've got a CAC that's accredited, that they meet national standards for medical care, mental health care, victim services, forensic interviewing, and the like. And so every faith community needs to get in their car and drive to their local CAC, meet those professionals, take a tour of the CAC and say, hey, who do you recommend are trauma-informed psychologists and doctors and other professionals, so you know in advance who you can make a referral to, and then say, hey, how can we be of assistance to you, and how could we coordinate spiritual care with the professional work being done here. And as CAC chaplains begin to expand across the country, how do we coordinate with that initiative as well?
Victor Vieth, thank you so much. I'm only regretting that we had more time together. But Victor Vieth, again, is the Chief Program Officer, Education and Research with the Zero Abuse Project. Could you just tell us as we close, Victor, how can folks engage with Zero Abuse Project? Where can they go for more information and learn more about the work that you guys do?
Sure. Go to our website, zeroabuseproject.org, and you could search the term Keeping Faith to learn more about that initiative and a whole host of other programs we have there. We have a initiative called Survivor Space, where adult survivors can connect and look for resources and the like. We have a lot of publications, and again, most of them are for investigators and prosecutors, but some of those might be of interest to the general public as well.
Well, thank you, Victor. Again, this is Jeff Dalrymple. We're with Evangelical Council for Abuse Prevention, ECAP. We provide child safety standards and accreditation for Christian ministries in the U.S. and U.S. territories. That's churches, schools, camps, any child and youth serving organization. We encourage you to learn more about Zero Abuse Project through their website, as Victor said. Also visit our website, ecap.net. By the way, Victor, the book that I gave to this group of pastors that I'm here with is What the Bible Says to Abuse Survivors and those who hurt them. And so be sure to check out some books and resources from Victor. Victor, again, thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving and Merry Christmas. I think that maybe is my first Merry Christmas wish to you. My daughters have been encouraging me to start listening to Christmas music. So this is a process for me. But thank you so much for being with us. Thanks to our audience and for your time. And we'll see you next time on Meet the Experts.
Thank you.